Welcome everybody. I'm Bill Kovaric, and this is a informal historian scientist interdisciplinary discussion about leaded gasoline and alternatives on the anniversary of the 1925 Public Health Service conference on leaded gasoline. It was a terrifically interesting bit of environmental history that's often overlooked. So I was motivated to try to keep it from being overlooked. And I think it's an important key to where we are as far as environmental regulation today. Um, there's a link to the transcript and other things in the emails and also on the website where this will be posted, environmentalhistory.org, which is the environmental history timeline. Um, we have scientists, historians, and policy experts, and I'm going to be doing introductions in just a moment, but just a little housekeeping. I think we need to mention, first of all, this is being recorded. I think that's de rigueur. Um, and secondly, there's a public event. Everybody's invited. And because of that, there's a little more security than would be normal with this kind of group. Um, but I don't think we've got much of a problem. There's also a chat function for questions and other points of interest. So with all that having been said, I'm happy to introduce our speakers and then ask, Dr. Um, Milky to start us off, and then maybe to follow up with Dr. Naraju, um, who are both scientists and very much aware of the history of this issue. So, and did I say thank you for coming? I appreciate it. It's good to see everybody. It's good to see old friends and new here. And then I would think Dr. Rosner after that, if we could go in sort of that order. And if Bruce Lanphier comes in, we'll squeeze him in somehow because he's on a tight schedule today. Okay. Questions before we start off? That's the housekeeping. Well, let me go ahead and introduce Howard Milky. He's a distinguished and I understand now emeritus professor. Has been with the Tulane School of Medicine. He's an expert on chemicals in the urban environment and has done some amazing work on the relationship between leaded depositions from leaded gasoline and lead poisoning in urban neighborhoods. Is that fair, Howard? Have I described your work a little bit?
Yeah, that's very fair. Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine, I think. I can hear you fine.
Okay. So I have a slide, but I'm trying to figure out how to get it onto the screen.
I need to share the screen sharing. So I just clicked that button right now. So now in the middle, there's a button called share. We're on Zoom, right? So there's a green button called share. And if you want to click on that and then pull it down, then you can probably get the screen share function going.
Okay, I'm supposed to see a green button in the middle.
Right. You may have to roll your cursor down over the bottom
Ah,
bar,
yeah,
and then it pops
got
up,
it.
and then you have all these commands down there. Do I sound like somebody who teaches media stuff? There we go. Good. It's working
All
fine.
right. And I'm on. Let's see.
Well, it's
It
working, but we're only
says
seeing part of it.
I am only seeing something that says Zoom Workplace.
Mm.
What do
Hmm.
I do with that?
Oh, okay. Wait. I'm
Can
having.
you leave it?
Just says join a meeting, sign up, sign in.
Ah.
Mm,
Hmm. Why
maybe
don't
close
you?
that. Oh, that's better.
Yeah, we
No.
can see part of it now. Dr. Lanfear is also here, and I want to make sure that he knows that he's going to be up second here, because I know he's got time constraints today. Welcome, anyway. And
I'm having,
There
okay.
you go.
There we go. Okay, great.
okay, terrific. Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. It's a little big. All right. Um, so I'm going to talk about the lead additive tragedy, but only briefly, because there's other things to talk about. And I'm mainly interested in not just how lead got into gasoline, but how we get lead out of gasoline. And um, the perspective of getting lead into gasoline, actually, Yandel Henderson uh, gave a lot of warning about this issue. And he thought that this was probably the greatest single question in public health that has ever faced American public. And you can read that he was terribly concerned that government was not being guided by scientific advice. This sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Um, so there was a proceeding, and it turns out actually that um, my brother-in-law's father was at the meeting. So I learned about the meeting as a result of discussions in Baltimore that I was involved in. He was at Johns Hopkins University and a very important mentor. The issue then that was brought up early on, before the conference took place in 1925, was that, first of all, Yandel Henderson was worried about inhalation and the fact that lead was being distributed to all organs, and it was going to be very difficult to measure. We had no real good, we didn't have good measurement equipment back in 1925. That didn't show up until the 1960s, for the general, at least for most researchers. So what Yandel Henderson was then concerned about was the development over time of the amount of material that was entering into the environment. And he thought that that leaded petrol would become universal. And that, in fact, is what took place. So what I am celebrating is not the beginning when lead was put into gasoline, but the ending when lead was taken out of gasoline. Excuse me. And Claire Patterson is certainly a pioneer in understanding how much lead was entering into the environment through his measurements that were taking place in the Arctic and Antarctic and also in the oceans. And he recognized that there was an enormous amount of lead going into the environment. And in the National Academy of Sciences, he observed that sometime in the near future, older urban areas of the United States have been rendered more or less uninhabitable by the millions of tons of poisonous industrial lead residues. My interest became heightened by the fact that this statement was taking place just at the time that I was completing some work that I was doing in Baltimore. And I will talk about that work. Another very important person at about the same time, 1979, was Herbert Needleman. And he recognized that the amount of lead showing up in children's teeth was related to their abilities in the classroom. And basically, the more lead, the more distractible, the persistency, a whole series of categories that were actually developed by the teachers. And I think all of you know this material. The issue about lead is an old issue, one that dates back in the case of the Diatheroides, that lead makes the mind go away. That was 200 before the Christian era. And um, Needleman wrote a chapter in 2013 that was entitled "Lead in Petrol Makes the Mind Go Away or Give Way." And I was fascinated by that chapter because he had previously spent most of his professional career talking about lead in paint. And here he finally realized that lead in petrol was a very important part of it. Now, we were always confronted by disinformation, and the lead industry played a role in disinformation. The Lead Industry Association had board minutes. This was brought to my attention by Markowitz and Rossner, and who were at the meeting, or at least Dr. Rossner is. The keeping attention focused on old leaded paint as a primary source to make clear that other sources of lead were not significantly involved. And that's simply even against what they knew at the time, but that ended up being a continued discussion by the industry to the point that everybody believed that it was lead-based paint. And I was backed up in 1974 in Environmental Health Perspectives by a project that was done by the lead industry on soils. And they were pointing out that lead and dirt around houses is due to the paint from the houses, and that lead anti-knock additives did not play a significant role in the dirt around the houses where children were playing. And I did some research on that topic. So the instrumentation that was developed was primarily used in the medical sciences for diagnosis of the lead exposure. And the diagnosis was lagging way behind the mass production of tetraethyl lead. And when I first started thinking about lead back in the 1960s, the methods that were used were very primitive. The best you could do is measure at around 60 micrograms per deciliter. It was not an easy measurement to do. And it wasn't until the introduction of the mass spectrometer, well, it's actually AAS was first used, atomic absorption spectrometry. And when that was introduced, it was realized that 60 was way too high, that must be 40. And then as we learn more over the years, these were called guidances at the time, 30, 25, 10. And finally in 2012, they started talking about the reference values. This was CDC's reference values. And I think Bruce was involved in that discussion in 2012 with CDC. At that point, the reference value was 5. More recently, in 2021, was 3.5. And in fact, there is no amount of exposure that's considered safe. So the experimental work that I did, I decided to take a look at the environment itself. And follows actually what Patterson was doing. Claire Patterson, however, he made a statement about the city, but really didn't have good backup information about the city. So I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Rufus Cheney at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And the first thing we had to do is develop a method for measuring the amount of lead in the environment, in the soil. And so we spent a lot of time doing that and came up with a method that worked very well. we tried to tune it to what human physiology, in terms of temperature and in terms of the pH that we were working with. And that held up very well. In the case of Baltimore, we had an inner city that was brick buildings and stone, and then we had an outer city that was painted wood. And so inner city, outer city, quite different in terms of what the buildings were like. And we collected, in this case, it was 422 samples across the entire metropolitan area. And working with the soils, it became very clear, or the numbers, it became very clear that there were some, I did not have the background in statistics. Fortunately, I had a brother who was a statistician, and he worked with the statistics on the distribution of the soil across the metropolitan area of Baltimore. And what we discovered is that the samples that were less than 100 parts per million were basically scattered throughout the outlying area, and that the samples that were above 100 parts per million were focused towards the interior of the city, as shown here. And that the clustering was extraordinary. P-value 10 to the minus 23, less than 10 to the minus 23. And as my brother called me and talked about it, he was flabbergasted as to what a huge difference there was in the amount of lead in soils within the interior of the city compared to the outer layer of the city. After this study, I moved on back to Minnesota. I'm a Minnesotan originally. And I wondered whether we'd see the same thing in another city. So this is a replication project. And in this case, I worked with some doctors who had been working with the Hmong children who were coming into the Twin Cities from outside of Vietnam. Basically, they worked with the Hmong were working with U.S. soldiers, and they were in terrible trouble in terms of not being able to stay where they were living. They had to move on, and they were they were brought in to several different cities across the country, including Minneapolis and St. Paul. And they lived in Minneapolis. They came in with very low blood levels. And after a year, their blood levels were measured again, and they suddenly were very high, and they were an enormous concern. And the doctor I worked with was Amos Dinard, and he said he didn't understand what was taking place. And so I did a survey across the city, and this was a transect city survey. Basically, the Hmong were living in an area of the city that was way above 100 parts per million, up to about 1,000 parts per million. And I had some insight that the interior, the urban environments had very high lead levels, and the children were going to be highly exposed as well. This is the large city map that we ended up doing over time. And the interior of the city, 500 to 1,000 parts per million was very common. And areas in the near urban areas outside the inner city, 50 to 100, and then in the country, soils outside the city, 5 to 10 parts per million. So you can see a tenfold increase from the outside to the suburbs, and another tenfold to the interior of the city. And I started realizing this is the pattern that we have in our cities. Now, in the midst of all of this, my daughter became lead poisoned. And I actually called Herbert Needleman and uh, told him about the poisoning and asked him for advice. And he said, well, you got to find the lead-based paint that she's exposed to. Well, we were living in a very nice house and it had been properly maintained. And I knew that lead paint was not going to be the dominant thing within the house. So I looked at the dust. I had the ability to measure the amount of lead. And what I found was that she was playing at a child care center. She was playing in a sandbox that contained 500 to 1,000 parts per million lead. And so knowing what I knew, I changed the soil. I brought in clean soil and her exposure declined very rapidly. So with this experience, I decided I had to do something. This is not, I was very concerned about the children of the Twin Cities. And so we developed a group of people, the Lead Coalition, and it was a small group of people, but very committed to study and act on lead. And we decided we had to get lead out of gasoline. And we knew how much lead was the state was working with compared to the amount of lead in gasoline and where the lead in gasoline was showing up. Yandel Henderson talked about the fact that lead was entering into the body, actually into the bloodstream through inhalation as a result of the particle size. And so based on that, there was a lot of, the EPA had already done a lot of work on this and realized that small particles were really important. And the driving of the lead aerosols that are driving the whole process of exposure. It's basically, once lead is in the air, it's everywhere. It's in the soil, it floats into the inside, it's in food, it's on the pets, anything that touches the soil ends up coming in, tracking in, or on the shoes. So this became a very important problem. And I worked with the state of Minnesota. The legislature became very interested, some members of the legislature. And so the legislature decided to do a lead survey. And the lead survey involved both measuring the amount, getting samples of soil by census tract throughout the state, and also blood lead. So the health department and the PCA, the Pollution Control Agency, were involved. And the blood lead levels of a fairly large percentage of the children were 10 to 19 in Minneapolis, and about, in this case, about 40% of the children in Minneapolis had blood lead levels that were above 10 micrograms per deciliter. And this is clearly unacceptable. And the children of the Twin Cities were having the same problem with lead as my own daughter. The median soil lead by sample type and city type, we had 3 different sample types in each of the census tracts. And indeed, foundation is very high compared to other samples. And the question then is what effect that has on children's lead exposures. Why is it so high on the, why are the soils around foundations so high in lead compared to other soil samples? Well, it turns out that lead in the air, as the air is floating, as the particles are floating, if they hit a vertical surface, the particles fall down the side of the surface. so the explanation about lead around foundations is related to the fact that there's a high amount of lead being captured by the buildings and then falling down the side to the surface. And unfortunately, these are very attractive players near the sides of buildings. So one of the first things we warned people about in the Twin Cities and in my own neighborhood was the players, not to have the players right next to the foundation, but to either move away from that area or take some steps to reduce the amount of lead in the environment so the soil lead would be lower. Um, the state of Minnesota then tried to ban lead in gasoline, and it turned out to be against the law. The state passed a ban on leaded gasoline, and the ban was rejected as it was against the law. So the state was advised to petition Congress and EPA and to take up the question at the congressional level and at the EPA, right to the EPA. And Senator Durenberger was the person who handled the petition and handled the bill that he had put together. And the bill was basically requiring a rapid phase down by December 1986 is what it ended up. The bill ended up. And I was invited to give a presentation, and I presented about the lead in the environment and what we had learned in Minnesota. And the hearing was based on basically it was a bill from Senator Durenberger and Senator Gorton. And the act then involved, it was called the Airborne Lead Reduction Act 1984. And the subsection that was particularly important was HA in section 211 in the Clean Air Act. And basically, the Clean Air Act was changed so that initially they started January 1st, 1988 as the date, and that was actually changed in 1986 after everything settled. And so under the regulation, leaded gasoline was reduced enormously, and there was some possibility of continuing with limited sales. And there is an abstract of my testimony, basically concerned about the children, the needs of children. And the
Excuse me for interrupting, but we will have a place for a lot of these, abstracts and papers to be posted. And there's a lot of other speakers too. So just a gentle reminder. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just about finished.
Thank you.
So thank you. And I do have papers of the materials from these conferences. So the difference when you look at the changes in blood lead, and you find that when lead was removed from paint, it didn't really make that much difference compared to the lead in gasoline. And the reduction took place very quickly in 1984, starting in 1985 and 86. And that's this area here. And blood lead levels came down very quickly at that point. I want to give you an example of a survey. After living in Minnesota, I was invited to go to a college of pharmacy in New Orleans. And I did a soil survey. And with the soil survey, I worked with the state to do blood lead. And here's the relationship between the two, very close. That when you have high soil lead, you have high blood lead levels. We started realizing that soil was a very important part of the process. And the consequences are enormous. Every organ system, the brain is particularly sensitive to lead, and we have an enormous amount of information about that. And of course, the modern concern, the consequences are that about half the population in the United States was was excessively exposed to lead during early childhood. And most of us were very highly exposed if we were born before 1980, which I think all of us are in that category. And so in 1980, from the 60s to the 80s, most children were above 5 micrograms per deciliter and way above 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. And starting after the rapid phase down of 90% of the lead in automobile exhaust, the reduction took place. And children's blood lead levels were below 5. And it's terribly important for our current generation to realize. Psychologists have become involved, sociologists have become involved, lots of good material from proceedings from the National Academy of Science and other places. So we did see over time, the soil lead levels are going down, blood lead levels are also going down in New Orleans. And that's a very important message, that if you want to change the blood lead levels, you have to do something with the environment. And we tend not to pay attention to soil in this case. My last slide, I just want to recognize that there were millions of children that were excessively exposed to tetraethyl lead. And I had amazing mentors and statisticians working with me that provided the real guts behind our research projects. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I truly appreciate the years of dedicated work that you've put into this amazing and difficult problem. So thank you. And I want to move quickly on to other speakers. I understand Dr. Lanphier is under a time constraint. After which, if we could work with that, I'm not sure how much of a time constraint, but if we could hold questions at least till after he is able to speak, is that fair enough for everybody? Dr. Lanphier, and I should be asking you to unmute here at this point.
How do I get off of this?
So the little green share button at the bottom, you just click off, you just hold it, and then I can actually do it.
The
I
little
think.
green button at the bottom. I'm
Yeah.
not finding it.
Yeah, these have to do with hang on.
Sorry, I don't see it. Something happened.
Something good, maybe? I'm trying to find my cursor right now. Which is okay. Come on. Technology just
it's going beyond me. I don't know what
nuts here sometimes. I'll tell you what.
Can you see my screen now?
Are yours
Yeah.
your Toxic Hearts? Hi, Bruce. How are you doing?
Yeah, I just stole the screen.
Yes. Oh, good. Excellent.
All right. So now the only challenge will be whether my audio works for the video, but I'll go ahead and get started. And I want to try to be quick because I'd like to hear a few others before I have to leave. And I apologize, I didn't hear about this till late. And I also want to just acknowledge all of you who taught me a tremendous amount, particularly history that I came to late, but I'm just loving it. So I want to talk in a very focused way about this mysterious decline in coronary heart disease and an attempt to take some of what you all have done and make it more accessible, because I think the lessons are so critical, particularly during these days. So I want to talk about the mysterious decline in coronary heart disease. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, David Jones has written a beautiful piece on that a decade or more ago. In the mid-1970s, it became clear that coronary heart disease was declining. It wasn't clear if it was a real decline, but there was several lines of evidence suggesting so, which led to a group of leaders, over 80 physicians and scientists from across the country, gathering at the NIH in 1978. The purpose of the conference were to consider whether the greater than 20% decline in coronary heart disease mortality since 1968 was real, and to discuss possible causes and recommend further studies to elucidate those causes. What they found was that there were 190,000 fewer deaths than expected. In short, they said it was real. The decline was real. Robert Levy, who was the director of what was then called the National Heart Institute, now the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, said the decline in coronary heart disease epidemic in the 1970s strongly suggests that we can control and eventually eradicate modern civilized man's most serious killer disease. And you don't hear people at NIH talk about like this anymore, right? He's talking about eradicating modern civilized man's most serious killer disease, like smallpox. He's not talking about let's invest in expensive drugs or immunotherapy or changing people's genetic structure. He's talking about eradicating this disease. I thought it was fascinating. They came up with a whole list of potential reasons for the decline. Maybe it was an artifact. Maybe it was better cardiac coronary care. Maybe it was surgery, Medicaid, less smoking. In the end, what Levy concluded 3 years later, it should be evident to the reader that we have too many rather than too few possible explanations for the decline. In other words, they didn't know what caused it. If you look at the decline in the United States, you can see, this is based on Jeffrey Rowe's article, there was a decline in deaths among men in the United States from coronary heart disease. Nothing happened in Britain. That despite the fact that there was a striking decline in air pollution, which of course was leaded, and this we'll get to the conclusions in a few minutes. Jeffrey Rose concluded then, because he believed the decline was real, in Britain then we are failing to prevent a preventable disease. But he didn't know why, nor did anybody else. Well, here are some of the obvious risk factors. Sex obviously didn't change. Obesity was on the rise, not the decline, along with diabetes. Salt intake, there's no evidence it changed. We'll get to hypertension in a minute. Physical activity, no evidence it changed, and certainly genetic susceptibility hadn't changed. Well, we have to include air pollution, and Howard sort of talked about that in a bit. But as I mentioned, air pollution was leaded. You really couldn't separate the two at that time anyway. So I want to show you just a short clip from our video that will be released in the next month or so. Again, this is an attempt to try to take this evidence and make it more accessible to a broader public. Hopefully you can hear this.
This is where things get really interesting. Thanks to growing public health awareness and lawsuits, the United States began phasing out leaded gasoline. The Clean Air Act, passed in 1970, was a game changer. Over the next 2 decades, the production of leaded gasoline plummeted, and with it, lead in air. As the use of leaded gasoline dropped, so did the amount of lead found in the blood of Americans. This toxic metal, which had been silently poisoning millions, was suddenly disappearing from the air we breathed, and with it, deaths from heart attacks. It doesn't get much clearer than this. But if you need more proof, we can look to Britain. While the United States saw a drop in heart attacks in the 1970s, Britain didn't, even though air pollution had declined. When Britain did begin to reduce production of leaded gasoline in the mid-1980s, however, heart attacks declined just as they had in the United States. But wait, it wasn't only heart attacks that declined. Hypertension, or high blood pressure, plummeted in the United States from 35% to 20%. That's a huge drop. That alone would have reduced the number of Americans on blood pressure meds by half. Scientists couldn't explain the decline with the usual factors, smoking, medication, obesity, but hypertension among Americans dropped in lockstep with blood lead levels.
So this really shouldn't have been a surprise. By 2008, Viziri had already accumulated all this data showing that lead enhances atherosclerosis in laboratory studies by inactivating nitric oxide, inhibiting endothelial repair, impairing angiogenesis, and promoting thrombosis. That is, it caused atherosclerosis. In a little known study in South Africa, a master's student just in 2023 did this remarkable study. She took little bits of lead and cadmium and added them to tissue culture where the endothelial cells, that thin cellular lining of the arteries, was in fluid. And she showed that even at extraordinarily low concentrations, you can see tears and blebs in the endothelial cells. In my mind, this is the initiation of atherosclerosis. It suggests that metals play a critical role in initiating atherosclerosis, and yet for too long they've been overlooked and neglected. And you can see even at levels of people exposed today, lead appears to damage the endothelial cells that create essentially like a pita pocket that can then get chock full of lipids and metals and inflammatory cells, which is basically atherosclerosis. So in conclusion, and I'm not going to go into some of the other details, heavy metals and air pollution, or heavy metals in air pollution, were the mysterious culprits of the rise and decline in coronary heart disease. They play a much greater role than anybody has given credit to, with maybe a couple dozen people, Ellen Silbergeld in particular, Rick Nevin as well. Was this new? Was this truly novel? Well, in 1889, Lorimer, an Edinburgh physician, noticed post-mortem that arteriosclerosis was found in 69 cases out of 107 in patients with Saturnine gout, lead-induced gout. In 2012, William Osler, the most influential physician of his era in Western medicine, said chronic lead intoxication plays an important role in the causation of arteriosclerosis, although the precise mode of action is not yet clear. Back to Yandel Henderson, we've already met him, and you're all very familiar with him. The leading chemical warfare expert in the United States warned the use of tetraethyl lead will cause vast numbers of the population to suffer from slow lead poisoning, the hardening of the arteries. Kehoe, on the other hand, at that meeting 100 years ago today, said the question is not whether lead is dangerous, they knew it was a poison, but whether a certain concentration of lead is dangerous. And he followed that up with, until tetraethyl lead is shown to be toxic, government agencies should not prohibit the use of ethyl gasoline. And you know what happened? They put the rights of industry over the health of Americans. And we've already heard Yandel Henderson's warning that was perhaps greater than the problem of lead itself. The greatest single question in the field of public health that has ever faced the American public is the question of whether scientific experts are to be consulted and the action of government guided by their advice, or whether, on the contrary, commercial interests are to be allowed to subordinate every other consideration to that of profit. And you can see 100 years later how we still are caught up in this mess, this fix that Yandel Henderson warned us about 1 century ago. Thank you for the opportunity, and I wish I could stay and participate with the rest of this. I've got 10 more minutes. I'll stay as long as I can. Thank you.
There's several people with questions, and let me ask anyone with a question, first of all, for Dr. Lanfear, to go ahead. And if you cannot unmute yourself, I will do it for you. Okay. You can't hear anything right now, or oh, I have to ask you to unmute. See, we're still working out the details. Aha. Okay.
I got it.
So,
thank you.
But if you need to unmute, then you can send me a message in chat. Okay, so that's one way to do it. The other way, of course, is under reactions. You can hold up your hand, you can clap, or you can, send a little, did that come through? Should have been a reaction there on the screen. Um, let's see. I'm not seeing the reaction. So apparently you're supposed to be able to hold up your hand with this. Still struggling?
David has a question. David's got
There
a
we
comment
go.
or a
I see.
question.
I don't have a question. I don't have a comment. I just want to say hi, Bruce, before you leave. It's great to see you. You're staying very young. I don't understand that. Um, you're living a good life. Hi. Just want to say hi before you go.
Thank you, David. Wonderful to see you as well.
I have a
All
quick
of you.
question. I have a quick question if nobody else has one right away. To what extent do you think the lack of instrumentation and physical proof of harm led the Surgeon General's committee 100 years ago to take a pass on the public health question? So was the technology simply not up to speed for public health and analysis?
Yeah, I think there were probably a number of things, Bill, and you know some of this, of course. We didn't have the technology to measure it. The type of studies they were doing were rather crude. How intentional that was, it isn't clear to me. You could certainly argue that the kind of study designs we use today are much more refined, of course. We didn't even really have the concept of environment or environmental laws back then. I'm not even sure, and I need to verify this with an environmental lawyer, that the laws even existed unless you were able to use some existing nuisance law to say, no, you can't use it. So I think there were a number of things. I think the most important thing for us all to recognize is that this set a precedent, what Jerome called, I think you called it, Jerome, the Kehoe paradigm, or I like the rule, but it's a little simpler word. It set this precedent, and we are still caught in this precedent where until you have shown repeatedly that forever chemicals or mercury or air pollution is toxic, you have no right to prohibit industry from using it, right? The Tosca law was tweaked, it wasn't reformed, and we're still caught up in this after the fact trying to fix the problem. It's nuts. I think Daniel had a question or comment as well. And then I've got to leave probably, although I'll try to stay till about 7:59.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Bruce. I just wanted to say, I come at this story over the past decade, and I really come at it from a storytelling angle, because so much of the failure in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and so much of the findings in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, as you showed, came down to informing the public. And trying to inform them effectively in a way that would break through and maybe make this point in a way that wasn't clear. And I just wanted to compliment you on not only your delivery, but that video you showed with those charts. I mean, the challenge is to make it clear, and it really did. I mean, I've studied all this, we all have, and I was struck by your charts and how they. Anyway, bravo, and thank you for trying to tell this story and keep the legacy of everything we could have done differently alive.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for your book. I didn't talk about Alice Hamilton today, but of course she's another one of our heroes, and deservedly so. And I think you're exactly right. One of the things I'm convinced that environmental scientists and academics in general, public health, need to learn is how to tell stories. And we don't typically tell stories from a person's perspective. I get that. That's hard. It's certainly hard for me, but we've got to find ways to tell stories better if we want our science to have an impact, or we need to partner with people like you.
Yeah. Thank you, Bruce. Bravo. Thanks.
And of course, Daniel Stone's book, American Poison, was just released in February, correct? And you're getting
Correct, yes.
A lot of very interesting feedback on it, I'm sure. So,
yeah. I'll mention Alice Hamilton when it's my turn, but yeah, for that nice segue.
And that brings up an important point. I think it's David Rosner's turn next, if that's okay, and then Jerome Naraju. Is that okay with everybody?
Sounds good.
Let me go.
I'm sorry I won't be able to stay for all of it, David, but I'm going to stay as long as I can.
So you should be getting the ask to unmute signal now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Great, great. Okay. I'm not going to be very long. I think we all know some of the early history, and we know a lot about its uh, current context. And we have great scientists here who are going to tell us all about the physiology and the science. But I just wanted to start out by asking you how many of us have ever discussed a conference that's 100 years old? How many of us have ever thought about it? Any conference that's more than 3 weeks ago. Um, Howard has, okay, and Bruce, the two of you, yeah. But what I'm saying is that this is probably the only group in the world that cares about a conference that happened 100 years ago. And the question is why? And what was it about that conference that brought together a whole series of issues that we're still dealing with today? I would just like to briefly point out that that conference came at a very critical time in American history. It came at the end of the progressive era, and it became during a period of time when the common comment about America was that what's good for General Motors is good for America. That this was a moment of real conflict. And when you look at that conference, what you see is that conflict working out in real contrast, in people really fighting with one another. Alice Hamilton, Yandell Henderson, Emerson. You look at those old progressive public health people who came to that conference with an ideology that was born out of the struggles of the early 20th century within labor, where labor was actually demanding things of American society that had, one, it had never had to do before, and two, had to do at this moment because of the vast industrialization of the country, the moment at which our country emerged as a major industrial power in the world, stopped being a country of small towns spread out by hundreds of miles and huge, vast different distances into large urban concentrations. It was a period of time when virtually human life was almost equated with being as dangerous, being a time as dangerous as being in war. You can look at that literature in the early 20th century and you could see what industrialization was doing to us. Millions of people were being thrown into factories and were literally being killed. Many articles, and I've written about this elsewhere, but many articles which really embodied a crisis in American culture. During that crisis, you saw emerge a whole group of people who came out of labor movements and social movements, who came out of attention to, the jungle and the articles that were appearing in the Masses and other journals that really came out with a commitment to seeing health as an indicator of social injustice. It was not just a technical scientific issue of how to prolong life. It was a statement about social justice and the responsibilities of the society to the American population. There was tremendous pressure, and we can see it in terms of even the preliminary legislation, the formation of the FDA, the creation of workers' comp, which were half measures that were meant to try to address the inequality that had emerged in American society. That was really tearing the society apart. It's at that moment that that we became aware of lead. Okay, I don't know how else to put it. Ford Motor Company suddenly comes out with Model T Ford, where literally making it possible for millions of Americans to drive around in cars, where the General Motors Company, which was a small, tiny company in the teens, emerges as a major marketer of a new kind of engine that's going to have power and going to transform the car industry from being a little sideshow into being the major driver of the American economy. And that you start seeing the establishment of major corporations that have a real stake in the future of how we're going to understand health. General Motors, DuPont, Standard Oil. I mean, think of the companies that went into the creation of ethyl gasoline, the ethyl company, which emerges at that point, all of which had a real stake in how we understood health and how we saw it as either a technological problem, right, that should be dominated by scientists and, I don't want to say this too broadly, but people that can be bought off, okay, and or alternatively by a government that would be responsive to the demands of a democratic society. So this was a moment of real tension. When you read that, I think we've probably all looked at the lead conference proceedings. What we see is that tension emerging full blown between the Alice Hamiltons, the Emersons, the Hendersons, all the group of people, the people from the Workers' Health Bureau. We often forget. We don't even realize. We now think of it as an emergence of a technological problem, but actually the way it emerged was because of the pressure of first the labor unions, which were dying in these plants, right? And also groups of women who were concerned about this group, the Workers' Health Bureau. I have a little slideshow, it's very brief, and I'm going to stop very quickly because, I want to hear from you. I don't need to hear from me anymore. But I don't know how to get this on the screen. Let's see, share screen.
If you roll your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you should see a control panel, and then there's a green button that says share, and you should,
right.
There you go.
Okay, so I'm just going to show you this. I don't know the slideshow. I'm going to just show it to you. I have this weird system where suddenly when I go into slideshow mode, 3 screens light up with different kinds of information, which I never understand. So we're just going to do it from here.
This is the paper that shocked me. I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt, but thank you.
Well, thank you. That's really nice to know that, this was a real revelation to us. This is the paper that we published in 1985 on the lead controversy and the lead conference. And it grew amazingly for academics who generally publish a paper and never see any mention of it again. It got a lot of attention at the time. It was, I think this is probably apocryphal, but I have to say it because it was told to me by Herbert Needleman when he was talking with me one time. And he said he was at a meeting down at the Public Health Service. And they were discussing a request by the Ethyl Corporation to prolong the use of ethyl gasoline for another 10 years or something like that. And that they were trying to decide on how long they should allow them to get out of the market. By that point, it was clear that lead had to be eliminated from gasoline. But the question was how long? And the industry said, look, give us time, give us more time. And supposedly, according to Needleman, and I don't believe it because I think that he was just, I don't know. He was a wonderful guy. He said that suddenly in the middle of this meeting, a secretary or somebody came in from outside and threw this article down on the table. And everybody looked and said, what? They've known since the 1920s? We're going to give them 2 years to get out of this business or whatever it was. It was really quite hilarious, but it was quite a compliment to the paper. But it was really a paper that shocked even the American Public Health Association, because in it we pointed out that the American Public Health Association itself had played a role in allowing industry to continue the use of gas. Before we talked, you were talking about how the technology wasn't adequate to measure, and that's the reason why we never really lowered it. In fact, the reason was because of the intense pressure from industry to really reshape our thinking about how to about gas and about ethyl leaded gas. And in the paper, we pointed out that the APHA had a representative, Hayhurst, who I think some of you may know historically. Hayhurst was a famous industrial hygienist who was a member of the editorial committee of the journal at the time. We didn't know that when we wrote the paper. But Hayhurst had written up an editorial in 1925 that said, lead is safe and lead in gasoline is safe. He said, observational evidence and reports to various health officials over the country, so far as we have been able to find out, corroborated the statement of complete safety so far as the public health has been concerned. This is the point when they were contending, when people were pointing out Hamilton and Emerson and the Workers' Health Bureau and labor unions were all pointing to the fact that these men had died from experience with this material. These are the headlines. This is just one little headline. You've all seen things like this. Victims dying from exposure to lead that were appearing daily in the newspapers. This is just a series of little snippets from different pieces of materials we found at the National Archive, which point out what the evolution of this problem. The evolution came from labor, not from scientists discovering anything, but it came from the pressure of labor. This is Henderson, who talks about who's writing to the Workers' Health Bureau, which had written him, complaining about these workers who were dying, and he becomes interested in it. Alice Hamilton, the suggestion made by the Garage Workers Union is that impartial investigations of this public health hazard be made. This is where she also came from. She, of course, came from a long history of lead. This is from the Surgeon General. It is admitted in your reports that the hazards of lead in workers and repair shops and garages in the future will be comparable to that with painters. And to anyone who knows how injurious these effects are, this admission is sufficient to counteract all the claims in the report. This is another report that was given out at the time regarding the harmlessness of lead in gasoline. Scientists are writing reports saying it's not harmful. And even the Surgeon General was influenced by the labor unions that were working at the time. I mentioned this. I'm just going to add this one little thing. When our article appeared, the revelations of the article seemed so shocking to the public health community that really clung to the idea that the only reason we were plagued by lead was that we didn't have enough information to change policy. And what the article was basically saying, it didn't matter about information. We had the information at that point 70 years before, 60 years before, but it was the activities of the industry that went out and claimed, as we call in our article, that lead was a gift of God that would change American society, and that all these naysayers who were rooted in this past history were really outmoded and really should not be listened to. When the study was done that suggested that we continue to follow we allow the use of lead. We have to remember that lead was actually banned from gasoline in some states. Anyone who lives in New York knows that when you go to New Jersey, you still can't pump lead because it was considered lead gasoline because of the legacy of this period of time. You have to wait for an expert to do it, attendant to do it. But the simple point is that the pressure was enormous from labor, but it was also enormous from industry that basically killed the study, made the study come out with half statements about how we should continue to follow it, which we did for the next 60 years under the leadership of Kehoe, that Bruce mentioned, who took control of that issue and never found an ounce of lead in gasoline that was considered unsafe. He was supported by the lead industry. He was supported by General Motors in the Kettering labs, and he basically stifled stifled all sorts of efforts to get lead condemned. So I'm just gonna, this is an editorial that they had that accompanied our article 60 years ago, and unsigned, they're apologizing. They're apologizing for the editorial that had appeared in 1925 in their journal. 60 years ago, an unsigned editorial appeared in the pages of this journal, which could plausibly be interpreted as deliberate propaganda on behalf of a large commercial interest. Its aim was to minimize the dangers of a new product, tetraethyl lead, whose introduction into gasoline was prompting expressions of concern from public health authorities. The editorial was written by a respected pioneer in industrial medicine who was secretly acting as a consultant to the chemical manufacturers, while also serving as a trusted advisor to labor organizations working to prevent lead hazards to handlers of new additives. The sad tale is recounted in the Rosner Markowitz article. That they had to actually apologize actually made it into the Times, believe it or not. The New York Times had a columnist commented on the American Journal of Public Health apologizing for something that had happened 6 decades before, which I found really amusing. And they found it amusing that this was happening. But the point is that that story, really is pointing out a much more fundamental problem we have, which that there are tremendous interests in all sorts of industrial health issues. And leaded gasoline set the standard, or was the example of that era's succumbing to the pressures of industry. I'm going to stop here because I'm just going off on a whole set of tangents. But the point is, let's not just think of this as a technological problem. It's not just an issue of how much, how much information we have, or whether we have better science or worse science. It's really a social issue about how we see health, how we see the responsibility of health, and how we see our responsibility as a nation to our citizens. So I'm going to stop here. Sorry for going on so long.
I am so grateful for your helping us to put this in historical perspective after hearing from 2 scientists, and then to hear from a leading historian here, really makes this, pulls it together. One thing I noticed about the actual transcript of the public health hearings is that already you see industry fudging and obfuscating data. Keogh's presentation 100 years ago today actually describes a study that did not of General Motors workers in Dayton that didn't include the people who died from leaded exposure. For example, the DuPont's Harrington, who was very safety conscious, also claims that his last death was in July of 1924, when in fact it had been only 2 months beforehand, in March of 25. And so there is this, pattern of obfuscation that industry is pulling together to gloss over some very deep and serious problems.
Yeah, I just want to point out that the lessons of the 1925 conference are very much alive today. I'm involved very directly in a whole series of environmental and occupational health lawsuits in which you see exactly the same kind of tactics being used to basically obscure the responsibilities of industries for killing workers and for polluting our environment. This is not an old problem. It's not a dead problem. It's very much active in the courts today about who's being asked to testify, what they're being asked to testify to, and what kind of information they're distorting. I sometimes dread when I'm in court and I see an epidemiologist come on for a company, because I know that what that epidemiologist's goal is to obscure the relationship in causation, to actually give enough doubt to a jury so that they can't make a decision about the responsibilities of a company for the death of a worker or for the pollution of a stream or the impact of a stream on a community. I'm now working with these polychlorinated bifield cases, and the efforts by Monsanto to basically obscure the relationship to what they poured into our neighborhoods and into our world and into us. And its relationship to problems we're having is just amazing. And the role that scientists play is really depressing sometimes, as I watch some of the scientists who are know better than what they're saying, when they know that all they're doing is introducing doubt when they say it doesn't meet the statistical standard of causation. And therefore, we can only say there's an association, but it's probably not that strong. It drives me bats. And so I'm not, I love this group of scientists who are on the screen right now, but I have a real gripe with the field that thinks that the only issue is better science, because that science becomes a tool, and a terrible tool, sometimes in obscuring relationships rather than clarifying them.
Before we move on to another scientist, which would be Jerome Naraju, could we have time for a question from Alan Loeb?
Hi guys. So I wanted to ask about the statement that David just made about Robert Kehoe could not approve of any amount of lead or something to that effect. I'm not actually exactly sure how he said it, but I interviewed Eula Bingham at the Kettering Laboratory. I interviewed her in 1993, and again in about 2017 or 18, and she was very adamant that Robert Kehoe was very frightened of tetraethyl lead, and he knew just how toxic it was. And part of the mission he felt he had was to make sure that it was controlled so tightly that there would never be any sort of mishap that would blow the whole thing open. And she told me about an incident in which he couldn't account for all the lead. He just went nuts because there was some amount of tetraethyl lead that didn't show up on the ledger, and he didn't know where it was. And he was just like frantic to see what had happened with his tetraethyl lead. Anyway, she went into great detail, which I will not repeat here, but I just wanted to say, as far as I know from somebody who worked directly with Kehoe, he was quite frightened of tetraethyl lead. So I'll put that into the conversation.
I actually spoke to Eula about him. She was a student of his, and she loved him. And we had a long talk at one point about our very different views. And she said, unfortunately, he did often obscure, well, not often. I mean, you can read his papers. He says it, that lead poisoning is not due to the gasoline. It's due to ceramics. It's due to candy that's imported from Mexico. It's due to paint. He had a real thing against paint, and he was great on that. But when it came to tetraethyl lead, he was a believer in that stuff, and he defended it. He attacked, the studies of lead accumulating in the Arctic. He was not a good person.
Yeah,
well, I won't disagree.
I think the problem with Kehoe is that he believed that leaded gas, when you burn leaded gasoline, what comes out is not toxic, or is not very toxic.
Right.
I think that's his thing. Yes, he actually believed that traditional lead was very toxic, and he made sure that he was protecting the workers. But once you burn the lead, tetraethyl lead, you get this chlorinated lead compounds and lead oxides. He believed that those were actually not. Once it gets into the environment, the exhaust, the automatic exhaust, was not toxic at all.
And he was the leading expert on lead and leaded gasoline for 60 years. I mean, he dominated that field.
Yeah, sure.
Thomas Keller has a quick question too, if we could squeeze that in. And then on to Dr. Naraju.
Try to be very concise. The question I want to put to you, David, references the last convening group that Bill put together. I don't know how many years ago, not that many, 4 years ago. And there was a sort of different cast of characters, similar format. And David, one of the people who was present at that earlier gathering was a woman who'd written a book that made an argument. Yeah, yeah. See, we are so my for everyone else's benefit, but you should note David's response, his clutching his forehead. The book, which I'm not going to be able to cite off the top of my head, but the argument of the book was sort of in support of a notion that the drop in urban crime rate correlated with at a 20-year lag with the drop in lead levels in cities. And this, touches on a topic that is of great interest and very politically salient. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Howard, for that show and tell moment. Just as an aside, touching on something that Daniel has brought up and
I'll tell you, I know that book, I know the argument, and also I know some very good friends. Bruce Lanphier believes that argument. I mean,
so this is my question: is tell me why you're clutching your forehead and
just clutching my forehead because I think that it ignores all the social reasons that Black kids, and I think it's a racist argument ultimately, Black kids are put in jail. It accepts the notion that jail is a objective evaluator of the behavior of people. And I think we all know that who ends up in jail and who doesn't. And that it's ignoring the entire social context of crime in general and ends up putting the blame on science and on technologies and on lead. It's a very nice, simple notion of reducing all these social variables that have led to the inequalities that not only create crime, but create people being put in jail and being jailed for also. My son is the director of medicine at Rikers Island, and his major job is to try to get young kids who have been caught jumping barriers out of jail because they're there and they don't have the $2,000 to get bail, and he has to write compassionate release letters all the time. It's such a misuse of science, and it's a misuse of this information, and it drives me crazy that we will never address the social world that has created these inequalities that have led to disproportionate jailing of people and also some more crime. We blame it on lead. And I think I think it's just obscuring so many social problems that it's not even worth raising. That's why I hate it. Bruce thinks differently, and I respect him so much. And he says the science proves it. I don't believe it for a second. That's all I can say. Sorry for being so crass about it, but being a social historian and watching how much we try to minimize problems or to at least find simple, singular reasons that can be controlled technologically as the reasons for the vast inequalities in our culture, I find a kind of a wrong approach to something as serious as jails.
So perhaps we could get Dr. Naraju to comment on that area as well. So let me ask that we turn it over to him.
Okay, so let me.
Thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you. Can you guys see me? See the slide?
Yes.
Okay, as some of you probably know, there have been 3 major epidemics of lead poisoning in human history. The first one is the Roman Empire time, Roman Empire, again, with the maximum exposure during the period of Pax Romana, or 27 to 200 AD. The next one is the, I call it British, Middle Ages, actually, call it Middle Ages, rather than British Empire, which includes both the Spanish, Portuguese, and British Empire. So Middle Ages. And it extends from 18th century to about the 19th century. And then you have the modern times. And for modern times, we need to start from 1860s with the introduction of chromated lead arsenate as pesticide. Some of you may remember, recall that chromated lead arsenate was the primary and the only pesticide in use, especially in the United States, from about 1900 till after the Second World War. Again, this was dissipative use, the environmental dissipation of lead, which again got exposed a lot of people directly to lead in their food. There are differences then in the exposure of lead during the three periods. During the ancient times, lead was primarily a consumer disease. And again, and some of you must have read that lead might have contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire. The Middle Ages, lead remained a consumer disease that affected most of the blue bloods, aristocrats that liked their wine and ate a lot of chocolate, especially amongst the women. I'll get to that in a few minutes. And then in modern times, when lead became an environmental disease that afflicted primarily or disproportionately the poor and inner city dwellers. If you look at the production of lead throughout human history, you find three peaks roughly, three peaks during the Roman times, modern times, and then this shoulder here, which will correspond probably to the Middle Ages or so. And if you look at the total production of lead, what I tried to integrate the area under the curve, and you get that the total all-time quantity of lead produced is something be around or between 400 and 500 million tons, which converts to something like 62 kilograms per living person. And although of the amount of lead that has been produced, it's estimated that something like 30 to 40 million tons were directly released into the environment. These would be things like lead gasoline, pesticides, and so on, that were directly released into the environment. And as somebody already mentioned, as far as we know now, there's no place on earth that is free of lead. I think it's Howard who said it, that is free of lead pollution. And more importantly, there's no safe level of lead exposure. Why is this important? Because if you look at the historical trend in records of lead in human teeth over the years, over the centuries, you find that during the Roman Empire period, the level exceeded this threshold of metabolic disease. That's during the Roman Empire period. And then after that, from about the 8th century onwards, the level has been going up almost exponentially until the present time. What that is telling us is that we've been piling on, it's simply being piling on or releasing so much lead into our environment that if in fact the previous empires could have issues with lead poisoning, could have affected their health, then think of what potentially could be happening to us. So we look at it in relative terms. In other words, But right now, we're so far ahead of every other empire, every other group of community or society that had issues with lead poisoning. But we are not really as, again, well, we're still not sure we see ourselves as being at the risk that I think we should be worried about. Anyway, so let's look more specifically then at lead exposure, lead in the Roman times. The lead, the Roman, this is lead, as you know, it's called the Roman metal. The Romans were exposed to lead in at least very many different ways. I'm not going to go into that. I wanted to pick out one exposure route that I believe played a major role in terms of poisoning or getting people above the poisoning threshold. And this is something called SEPA or must or diffractum. What is this compound? What is this compound, or what's this sauce, or what's this syrup? It's grape juice or new wine boiled down in lead pot or lead vessel. When you boil lead kettle, or when you boil an acid compound like grape juice in a lead kettle, you leach out a lot of lead. And what happened then is boiling the grape juice in lead vessel or pot ends up with what is lead acid, which is sweet tasting or sugar of lead. And so basically what was happening then is they were in fact converting the grape juice new wines into sugar of lead or lead acetate. At that time, they really didn't have sugar. I don't think they've invented sugar yet. So if you have one a Roman lady or cook wanted to sweeten the food, he had two options: either use the SEPA or else use honey. There was no sugar. Honey was expensive. And so it meant then that a lot of the foods then during the Roman time was in fact had in fact used the sugar, they added the sugar of lead to it. Again, as I said, in many cases even they use the SEPA as a substitute or adulterant for honey. SEPA was loaded with lead. There have been efforts to people have tried to actually boil grape juice in different types of lead kettles or lead pots, and they end up with lead concentrations of 100 to 1,500 milligrams per liter. One spoon of that stuff had enough lead to poison a child. Again, this is, people have done the experiment. So again, and that's what people were using to sweeten their food, and so as preservatives and so on. Another source of exposure were the Roman wines. A study came out in my book. Actually came out, found 14 different ways that the Roman wines were contaminated with lead. The most worrisome included the use of SEPA to upgrade or sweeten the wine. So if you had this erratic brew, you want to doctor your wine or sweeten it, a lot of people would then add SEPA to it. I know how much lead that SEPA contained. Alternatively, and this was also found to be worrisome, was you simply add lead oxide to blunt the acidity. So if for some reason you end up with this vinegar, for instance, contains something that is really bad, you simply add lead oxide. That will blunt the acidity of your wine. This was commonly used. And then there are other uses of lead. For example, the use of lead lips on wine vats, storage of wine storage in leaden vessels, and then they use a strip of lead to as a test to see when the brewing should stop. So all you need to put is simple: put a strip of lead in your vat or the brewing container, and then watch it when it changes color to exactly they're ready to start to bottle. So again, in the process, obviously, you are contaminating the wine with the lead. So again, both wine, the use of wine, a lot of the wines during the Roman times, as well as the use of cepa, were what I thought were the major sources of exposure. I know people still talk about, well, the Romans couldn't be getting so much lead because the lead pipe was, the water was hard, the water in Rome was hard, and therefore the corrosion of lead pipe was very low, or the residence time of the water in the lead pipe was small. But these were not the major source of lead exposure, believe me. I think there were other more important lead exposure during the Roman time. Okay, so we know that the lead, how much lead the Romans got. Well, let the dead talk to us, tell us how much lead they got. So we look at the bones. A lot of the lead we have is stored in our bones. And so let the dead speak to us. And if so, people have looked at the lead concentrations of bones from Britain this time, during the Iron Age, before the Roman times, and then during the Roman Empire time. You see there's a huge difference. The concentrations we find here were monks, or what you would in fact expect in people with elevated lead levels, or in fact people that you would consider to be above whatever the safety threshold is. So that's it. If you were to convert these bone lead levels to blood lead levels, they certainly will show that whoever had the bones when he or she lived, was at high risk of lead poisoning. The Romans also released a lot of lead during the production and use of lead products, and these were transported, as you know, into and deposited or archived in various places like the Arctic ice snow layers, as well as some bog deposits and lake deposits. And people have actually tried to use these archives to estimate how much lead the Romans would have been in the Roman environment, especially in the air, specifically in the atmosphere. How much lead was released into the atmosphere during the Roman times. And these are some of the results recently published. As you can see, the deposition of lead. This is in the Arctic layer now. Deposition rate could be as high as 200 microgram per square meter. I don't know what that will translate into in terms of lead in soils. I don't know, maybe Howard has some information on that. But you can see there's huge, very large deposits of lead in soils during the Roman times. And because the large deposition of lead or high deposition of lead is estimated to be contributing something like 2 to about 3.5 microgram per deciliter of lead. So enough, in fact, to put the people at risk. This is the contribution from the deposition of lead from the atmosphere as a result of the mining, smelting, and use of fabrication of lead products during the Roman time. And this covered a wide area in the Middle East. So let's talk about who are the people the poisoning then and the effects of the poisoning. I looked at the number of emperors who displayed any type of any that had any sign or symptom of lead poisoning. And I was especially looking at gout, because gout an easy thing that any doctor could diagnose, and therefore there were people kept talking. If you look at the history of the Roman times, there were people, they were talking, you find a lot of these emperors were said to have had gout, or else showed the various cognitive signs and symptoms that could be attributed, in fact, to being impaired by lead. So if you look at the emperors that had some sign or could be said to have been at risk either through exposure, because a too much drinker were wine drinkers and so on, you find that quite many of these emperors could have been encompassed or could have been had problems with lead poisoning. So you go from Tiberius, you heard about Caligula, Claude Nero, Galba, Vitellius, and Domitian. These were had all signs of lead poisoning. Then if you go to go down the list, you have Nerva, Julianus, Verus, and so on. And then you go all the way down to the end of the Pax Romana period. Yeah, this one here, you still have many of them. So basically, one can say that a large number of these of the Roman emperors would have had issues with lead poisoning. And why specifically the Roman Empire, or the aristocrats, sorry, again, because they were the people who drank most of these so-called doctored wines. These are the expensive doctored wines. They were the people who ate these as food with sweet and sour, that we are highly prepared foods. For instance, a slave normally would have a loaf of bread and water, to a large extent. So it is mostly the Roman aristocrats. And then you have, they were all involved, some of them were involved in the so-called Roman feast. I'm sure some of you have heard about Roman feast, where you could just eat. After eating, you go out and throw it off, go back and continue eating. So again, I'm not surprised that most of these aristocrats and emperors would have been exposed to very high levels of lead, and probably could have experienced some type of lead poisoning. And so when we talk about lead and rum, in my text and my paper, I never said that lead caused the fall of Rome. I never said that. It was never said. All I said was led to the decline, or contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire. And I still believe it. Why do I say so? Okay. We know from historical written evidence, written records, that the old aristocracy suffered massive reproductive failure, died out during this Roman Empire period. Again, I showed you the list of the emperors, and most of them had signs or displayed signs or behaviors that put them at risk of lead poisoning. we know that most of the aristocrats could not reproduce themselves. They were infertile. Again, there are all types of excuses. Many of them were what do you call it? Were well, okay. I was in the terminal, I have the right name. Anyway, most of them couldn't reproduce themselves. We know that miscarriages and stillbirths were very frequent amongst the women, very, very common amongst the women. We know infant mortality was rampant during the Roman Empire period. We know that the incidence of mental incompetence was very common among the aristocratic progeny. These were all effects that could be expected from being lead poisoned. And then, of course, the incompetence of the emperors and usurpers was well recorded in the textbooks of the time. So again, what we are saying then is sorry, let's go to this. Okay, that the lead poisoning did not contribute to did not cause the fall of the empire. There are all types of things I will talk about, but basically contributed in changing the trajectory of the
Dr. Naraju,
society. Yes.
Dr. Naraju, I do hate to interrupt. These slides can be made available on the website so that we could move rather quickly through them, and then other people could come back to them.
Gotcha.
So would be happy to do that.
I got you. Okay, so let's look at the Middle Ages then. And here I just give you an example of the so-called royal malady, which is the diseases that likely could be due to lead poisoning of three British dynasties. Queen Mary, for example, had could have had lead poisoning. Well, could have had indications. Sorry, the red dot referred to show signs of disorder, whereas the red dots show that they actually have the disorder. So if you do that, you see that from the 17th century onwards, a lot of the Roman British aristocrats actually had either gout, porphyria, or colic. So quite a lot of these British aristocrats. So we go beyond that then. Who are another example is Queen Anne of England. Some of you must have read about her. She definitely had gout, gouty Queen Anne, they call her. And then what were the sources of lead poisoning during the Middle Ages? Is from adulterated wine, and then foods. A lot of foods were contaminated, and then chocolate. And there were, in addition to the British aristocrats, we also know that we had all types of crazy aristocrats in the other European countries. Another one, even in Germany, the 16th century, the mad princes of Germany, for instance. And then chocolate. There's a study that found that over 100 references that link the consumption of chocolate to impotence, which of the aristocrats, which probably reflected suggested that they had lead poisoning. And then a study of chocolate during the 18th century, found that practically most of them had high lead levels in the milligram per gram range. So these were loaded with chocolate were loaded with lead. Again, as I was saying, the rise and fall of the empires was not due to lead, but due to economic decline, military outreach, all types of things. At least 50 different excuses, reasons why empires fall. All I'm trying to say, what some people say, is that lead was one of the contributing factors. And for the only side, we're trying to bring science on top of science into the whole thing. So what about modern times? Again, let's look at the production. I want to emphasize the production of lead that has continued going up up to the recent times. So when we talk about, well, what do we do next? If indeed the previous empires had issues or were compromised by lead poisoning, think about what may be happening to us. Howard said that something like half the people in the US have blood levels above the so-called safe threshold. If you look at it globally, it's something like half of the urban population had, during the 20th century, had blood levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. So if you look in the rear view mirror, see what is happening to the during the 20th century, and are we seeing some signs or similar things that happened in Roman times and during the Middle Ages, when we're seeing almost similar issues happening to the aristocrats? Example, the aristocracies and business dynasties of 20th century have petered out. Example, think of these mighty pioneers of American technological development. The K-holes, not the K-holes, the people who, the Fords and Chryslers and all those people. You see, we don't hear too many people like that. Like them anymore. They pretty well died out. Now we see the same thing with bad government and miscarriage of justice. Again, that was what contributed to the decline of these empires. The the management and the government became quite erratic. And then, if you think of the recent kings, queens, and presidents, think of their children. In the old days, you have these dynasties that were, extended into decades, if not multiple decades. The Rockefellers, for instance, the Kresges, and all those people. Now, you can't really, if you think of them, you can't think of any of those pioneers, what their children have done or what their children have become. If you think of our presidents, you think of, other than the Kennedy, you think of other presidents that have had, where you have their children or their sons being considered worthy of being elected as the next president, which used to happen in the past. So again, these are interesting analogies that I guess fascinating. And then the incompetence. Okay, well, I don't know about you, but somehow I think look at some of these presidents and kings and rulers, and how competent are they? Really, you worry about their incompetence. It was the way the world is going now. Again, you wonder, is there anything to it? Is that any anything to that may be linked to some type of the environment affecting the competence of the contemporary generation. But all I can say is the impact of lead exposure on the mental competence of the people of the modern population societies remain to be studied. And again, I suspect that if the real studies are done, we may find that in fact they may it may be affecting the trajectory maybe of our culture, society, government, and so on. Okay, I think I stopped so far.
Well, thank you. And I want to, first of all, say thank you because you're of a generation of scientists and activists that includes Claire Patterson and Herbert Needleman. So, I mean, I hope you don't mind. I put you in that category among, some of the great people who have really made a huge contribution in this area, especially in the 70s and 80s, and were so instrumental in waking people up to these kinds of hazards. So I think it's worth mentioning that your contribution has been much appreciated, perhaps in smaller circles than it deserves to be. But I think we might have some questions. And who should I unmute? Should I just unmute everybody at this point? I might be able to do that. Yes, I can do that. It's amazing the powers that one has. So you can jump in here. Thank you.
Or doesn't have.
Questions?
Yeah, I had been looking at the word leader, and it comes from the joining of joints in putting together a gutter system. It was Roman leader, which is made out of lead. I just always was fascinated by the fact that lead and leader, and it's all the same word. I mean, it's kind of a weird issue.
I have a semantic question also, SAPA, which is related to an old word for a person who's a fool in English would be a sap. Is there any relationship there?
I don't know how to look at the origin of the word sap, but
I'll have to look it up in my OED.
Right, yeah.
I also wonder if, like Patterson and Needleman, you got a lot of pressure from the industry on your work and a lot of backlash to your work. Was that a factor for you in the academic world?
Yes, definitely. I give you an example. I use that. It's 1980, 87, 88. We did a study that found that candles contained lead wick, right? And we found that in fact, when you burn the candles, you are going to be releasing a lot of lead into the indoor air. Not only that, some people now are inhaling the fume, for some, for some type of medicinal thing. And so once we published that, the sale of candles dropped by 10% nationally.
That's all?
And the Lead Industry Association wanted to get me signed because they said I was an illegal immigrant. Again, I got a lot of yes. You can say that I got a lot of angst from the Lead Industry Association. Right. I've been threatened many times. Yeah.
Well, I asked a historian some years ago whether or not they believed your description of the influence of environmental toxins on history and especially on the physiology of the leaders, especially the bifurcation of the sampling from the Roman Empire. Some of the classified bones had very high lead levels, and others had very low, which would correspond and which did correspond with upper and lower classes, right? So I made this argument and literally got laughed out of the room by a bunch of historians. So that's crazy. Nobody really believes the Romans could have possibly the empire fell because they were mining some metal. And of course, they would exaggerate the straw man argument. So I often felt like you had been pretty thoroughly misrepresented for, in by historians. And I don't know where that comes from, except maybe the industry assurances that, oh, this is all just a bunch of hot air, but yeah, it's taken a while. And I would imagine that today your thesis is more broadly accepted. Is that?
Yeah, yes, that's definitely because we have more evidence now.
Yeah.
First of all, we have more data on bone lead. We now have data from the teeth, which are better provide better records of exposure. And now we have the even economists linking the emissions to the economic activities during the Roman time. So now we got evidence from all different lines of evidence, all pointing to the fact that in Roman times, the exposure definitely was high enough to represent a health hazard to many people.
Well, we could keep going for a long time. Thomas Beller has a question. As you have your hand up there.
Yeah, just a very specific question about one of the graphs at the end when you showed the amount of lead mining that's being done over the course of the 20th and into the 21st century. And I saw that there was a real spike around 2000 up. And I wanted to know what accounted for that spike.
Oh, to a spike. No, it's the
battery production?
That's when they started phasing the lead, removing lead from paint and so on. That was when the environmental people. That was when they started recycle. First of all, there are several factors. I'm sorry. The recycling of lead became more effective or more organized, especially from automobile batteries. And so you didn't have to use as much as new lead from the mines, right? So it's recycling.
Well, that should have been a drop, though. That should have been a drop in lead production, I think, is Tom Speller's question. There's a spike around 2000. It goes up.
It kept going up. No. Then it started coming. You're talking about the right limb.
Right.
So it's the normal trajectory.
Okay.
At that point, then after that, it sounds like a spike. Then is this the recycling and reduction in the use of lead has caused it to start to go down or at least flatten out?
Mm-hmm. There's another point that you made. We had a similar seminar about 4 years ago, and you made a point that the elimination of leaded gasoline through a United Nations initiative had a lot to do with the way cars are recycled from Europe to Africa.
Yes.
And that taking that by the time 2021 rolled around, that these are all cars that used unleaded gasoline at this point, and that was really the economic reason driving the elimination of lead in fuels across Africa and the Middle East. And I thought that was a good point, and I imagine there's more information and data about that at this time.
Right. Yeah.
You were a little skeptical of the United Nations claim that they had done so much to take care of
again, they encourage the shipment of automobiles that burn leaded gasoline to Africa. then these old cars that didn't weren't doing anything. So they were shipping huge quantities of lead to to the African countries, and then claiming credit. They saw the problem in the U.S. and Europe. Meanwhile, all the problems were being shipped to the developing countries. And this is what they call global environmental injustice.
Right. Yes.
Good point.
And if there's other questions, go ahead. Otherwise, I want to turn it over to Thomas Beller in a minute, and then to uh, I'm sorry, to Daniel Stone, if that's our speaking order, that'll be okay with everybody. Go ahead, Howard.
Oh, you were asking about pressure that you got for, that Jerome had from industry. I had pressure as a result of getting lead out of, they were using lead, it was a lead product, lead acetate in hair coloring agents. And it was widely used. And I worked on that issue as a result of it was kind of funny. Went to a drugstore to pick up some toothpaste, and my daughter was with me, and she was across from me along the counter, and she spotted hair coloring agents, and she put one in my hand, and she said, "You've got to use this." And I looked at it, and I said, "It has lead acetate. I can't use that." And her response was, "Oh, Dad, everything you touch turns to lead." I had fun with that. But
Alan
I
Loeb
did get
has
a lot of pressure.
Alan Loeb has a question. Alan,
Yeah,
quick.
just on the UN initiative to get lead out in Africa and other places. Initially, that started with an initiative by the USAID in 1995. And I happened to be there at the time. And the driving force was that the diplomatic community got behind taking the lead out in Egypt. And Mubarak got behind it also because he felt that there was some articles in the New York Times that had recently come out saying that industries wouldn't want to locate in Egypt because managers who might bring over their families didn't want their children to be exposed to the high lead levels in Cairo and vicinity. And so it was a very interesting thing that they did. They had to convince the taxi drivers and everybody to do this. But it was the diplomatic community that got behind it and helped finance this. And then once it was done in Egypt, the UN looked at it and said, well, if you could do it in Cairo, then you can do it anywhere. But it was also because right after that, you had 9/11, and the U.S. Transferred all the money from security to, from environmental to security issues. And so the U.S. wasn't going to push this through AID. And then UNEP picked it up, and it took several decades. But the initial force was the demonstration.
There's a 2002 turning point for UN environmental program, right? Yeah.
So the initial sort of proof that it could be done was in Cairo, and I was there to watch. So
it's a good point. Have you?
I was the guy in the room with the checkbook, so I got real close to it.
Did you ever put that in a paper? Did you write about that?
Alan? It's stuck in chapter 19, but it hasn't ever been published. Actually, yes. USAID did a story. That was 1995, and then I went back a year and a half later, and they were really determined to make an article out of it. And they have this journal at AID called Frontlines. And so first thing they had me do before I went off to my project was tell us how you did this when you were here before. Mm-hmm. And when they published it, it went to all the USAID bureaus across the world. And then one day my phone rang when I was at Argonne, and it was somebody from India, and they wanted me to come over because the ambassador had read the article from USAID. So this thing just sort of snowballed, but Cairo was the start.
Yeah, okay. Did they ban the importation of used cars to Egypt at the time?
I'm sorry,
Did
attacks?
they ban the importation of used vehicles into Egypt at the time? Because that was the main problem.
Well, actually, I don't know about that. I mean, there's some parts of it that are very funny, and it's sort of a long, curious story to tell, which I won't do now. But it had quirky details of how they managed to build political consensus to pull this off. And I don't recall much discussion of imported cars. I mean, it's only the part that I was involved in, that I know about. But that was something I didn't hear.
I
Could
do want
very
to
well
hear
have been a
more about
factor,
that
but
in the future. I really do. This is sounds fascinating. I want to keep moving to Thomas Bello.
yeah.
We can do that.
Right.
Thanks for hearing me out on the story.
Well, no, thank you. And do we have, yeah, Tom, your mic's open. There you go.
Okay. Hi, guys. It's very nice to be here. Thank you, Bill, for setting this up.
Thank you.
And thank you to Howard and to David Rossner in particular, who have been so helpful to my understanding of this subject. By way of introduction, first of all, I'm going to be quite brief, but for those I haven't interacted with before, I bring no expertise and academic chops to this matter. My background is as a novelist and a personal essayist. I teach creative writing at Tulane University, and I got involved in this because of a personal experience in New Orleans. I have to say, Howard, it fascinated me to hear you say that in your moment of distress, as you were trying to sort out the situation with your daughter, you got Herbert Needleman on the phone. It's kind of cool. It's almost like saying, I was making a home movie and I called Francis Coppola up. I needed some advice, and he picked up the phone. Sort of has that quality. But I want to share with you guys that I had that experience myself with Howard. And maybe it's best you don't answer at the moment, Howard, but I'd like to put it before you that I have two questions that I'd like to touch base with you after this about. And one is if I have permission to contact your daughter, your now adult daughter, because while Howard was sort of trying to placate me and my wife, had an upsetting experience involving the sanding of an old house in New Orleans near ours. And at some point, Howard mentioned that he'd had an experience like that himself with his kid at an elevated lead level, and I said something like, how is she now? And he goes, oh, she's a doctor. She's doing great. And I've never been so happy in my life to hear, of the good news about someone else's kid, because I, at the time, just didn't quite know what I was dealing with. So question one is for later discussion between us, can I talk to your daughter if that's okay? And the second question, again for later, I think, but I'm curious to know when you came to my house to do a kind of like, really like an educational and emotional support house call to parents who had just been introduced to the topic of lead and lead poison in this very abrupt way. If this was something you did once every other year, or if this happened, once a month or a few times a year, that you would be summoned by Wasserman, the pediatrician, or some other pediatrician, or just word of mouth to go sort of console and uh, educate parent, people in some personal distress. So that's my way of prologue. To the rest, everyone else, I just want to say I have been muddling around in the topic of lead for a very long time. It seems to be, dare I use the phrase, an occupational hazard that people interested in this topic end up in these kind of Ahab and Moby Dick like scenarios where they set off to comprehend and express their understanding of the situation, shall we say, the lead predicament, and it becomes very difficult to gather it into a narrative and feel like there's a sense of closure to the narrative, or they've been able to finish or publish, or there's even someone like Bill who put his amazing dissertation online has sort of remained attached to the topic, even as he's pursued other interests in other, not even necessarily adjacent fields. And I, for better and for worse, I'm joining that slightly dubious fraternity. Um, my angle on this is, like I said, not as a science writer or a scientist. I'm like a novelist and a personal essayist. So I've been working on a book that sort of assembles pieces that combine a personal narrative, a memoir, you can almost call it, with explorations in the archives, explorations among your work. A lot of the people who have been on this Zoom, I've been very engaged with. Howard was directly involved. David Rossner and Jerry Markowitz were very important to my understanding because all this happened just around the time they published Lead Wars. So what I wanted to share with you guys was I've been in and out of various rabbit holes related to this story. Daniel, you should feel pleased to know that I had been meaning to buy your book, but only this conference today did I actually buy the book and intend to read it because I'm quite interested in um, your ability to like go out on the ship and then come back, dock the boat, get off the boat and get on with your life. But I'm also personally interested in focusing on a few individuals as individuals and constructing my book as a mix of like personal essay and essentially biography or brief biography, which is obviously somewhat the approach you took, Daniel. And I wanted to share with you guys that one of the people I've chosen to really try to, I don't know what to call it, research, original reporting, delve into in detail is Yandel Henderson. And everything I've heard so far today does makes me feel like it's been worth it. I mean, it evidently is worth it just because what initially got my attention was how emphatic he was in 1925. So, Bill, when you came up with this 100th anniversary gathering, it was, really great because I hadn't actually put it together that it was a 100th anniversary. But also, I do think that conference is helpful to our understanding of the whole situation. And partly it's because there was this like reckoning. And particularly Henderson got up there and spoke so emphatically. And and I'm coming to the end of what I wanted to share with you guys. What I've been intrigued to kind of discover is the nature of Henderson as a person and as a thinker, I guess, because he seems so brave and in his emphasis and his certainty. There's another side of that, which is like he's kind of like a really difficult, entitled, blowhard sort of guy. I think I'm not that equipped, but I went to Yale and looked. He doesn't have his own letters, but he was around for the formation of the medical school. So his letters appear in other people's boxes. And I muddled through that. And, I didn't really know what I was looking at, but he sounds kind of cranky and he's just pissed off about stuff all the time. And I have managed to just bushwhack my way to the family, for lack of a better word, and managed to kind of become in physical possession of some of his personal papers. And I wish David was here because I was very intrigued by his response to the question of crime and lead. And I won't presume familiarity with the Rossner Markowitz oeuvre, but it's very connected to issues of social justice and essentially political movements. And you heard his objection to the idea that lead can be used to explain crime rates. Where I'm going with this is there's a real upper class kind of, the best way you could put it would be noblesse oblige, I guess, but Henderson is a tricky guy. He was a Yale guy, he was a mountain climber, he was into boating, he was a yachtsman. And I'm sort of sorting through this issue of like whose voices gets to be heard. It's not the emphasis of what I want to write about, but it's kind of there. And I wanted to mention it and mention the idea that this messenger is sort of I don't even want to say flawed, just complicated as a person and try to think through what that means. So I'm actually sitting amidst some papers and I was trying to think, in conclusion, how I could share something that would be amusing or just sort of punctuate the Henderson part of my offering to you guys that I'm trying to think about Henderson. And I had provided come up with these tiny photographs from a trip on a boat called the Diana from 1924. So this is a year before he gets up in front of Congress. Our guy, he's sailing around on this boat. Here it is. It's just like, I mean, you can't see a thing. It's a little sailboat. It's not like some tremendous, fascinating thing. Here is a kind of, you know, party picture. There you could see some family members on the prow of the boat, and they're pulling along a little canoe in the back. And here's a shot from like beneath of our man, Captain Yandel, presumably steering the Diana through the treacherous waters of God knows Long Island Sound or whoever the hell they were up there. Here he is. And I'm glad to share this sort of trivia about Henderson, but I want to put it to you that I'm thinking about him. And if any of you guys have any thoughts about Yandel Henderson in terms of certainly factual matters, his testimony in 1925, thoughts about things I would benefit from thinking about regarding Yandel Henderson, any feedback at all on that specific matter of Henderson, that is what I'm trying to put together. I'm happy to hear it now. I sort of feel, for the interest of brevity, that it might be better if you could tap it out in an email or call me. I'm going to share my phone number with all of you, just occurs to me in the chat, because I would love to hear from any of you that are on this call. Here we go. Please don't give it to the spammers. And then that's it. That's it. I'm thinking about Henderson. I'm on my own crazy. What was the name of the boat? What was the goddamn name of the boat in Moby Dick? Anyway, I got my own version of it. I'm out here like the Pequod, right? Staring. It's all Melville here. It's 60% Moby Dick, and you're just out there looking for the white whale. I'm speaking for myself. And 40% Bartleby the Scrivener, where, like, various members of one's family, Howard, I was very amused about the story regarding the hair dye, but they're looking at you like Bartleby the Scrivener is the guy that wouldn't leave his office. Like, do you want to go home? He's like, I prefer not to. He's just going to live in the office. A Story of Wall Street. That's that's where I am, and I'm glad to have you guys as company. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to make a quick comment, and then I think Alan had a question, but my comment is that Henderson, at the end of this conference 100 years ago, there was a formation of a scientific committee to investigate leaded gasoline, which then reported in January. Well, Henderson was not asked to be on the committee. And he, I'm sure, took that a little bit, it was a little bit rough for him because he was the expert. And when he looked at the study that was coming out in November of 1925, wrote a memo to who was the chairman, who was the head of public health at Yale at the time, and I forget his name, saying that this was a half-baked study and that they really shouldn't give, leaded gasoline a clean bill of health. So he was one of the few people who was, of course, Henderson and Alice Hamilton, who were completely honest, and Grace Burnham, I think, also as well, who were completely honest about about the problems, and was not really given. So that goes to the question of who gets to speak. And this conference decided who was going to get to speak and who wasn't. And there's a couple of other angles along those lines, but specifically to Henderson, he was excluded from the experts committee. And then that's just a comment. And Alan, I'm going to do the unmute thing here. Did you have your hand up, Alan?
Yeah, I did. Hold on. Did you? So real quick, my view of Yandel is that he was, and I met these people, in modern times, it's a personality type, highly idealistic and intelligent enough to realize, like other people did not, that what was being warned against was actually likely to happen. Whereas other people said, well, yeah, lead could get out there and it could accumulate, but we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how long this is going to be used. We don't know how much it's going to accumulate. Maybe, percolates into the soil. We just don't even know. But he was very, very frightened by the prospect of what it meant. And he was just very strident and spoke repeatedly before the New York Times and the New York World in interviews. And it just got defeated. And you look at the rest of his life, he stayed in the field, and he wrote a book with Haggard, his associate at Yale, and put out some reports on an, I guess, annual basis. But he really got pushed out of the market entirely. And, it was a guy who they destroyed. But he was determined to make his case. Like you will see people now, and they will do the same thing about the current administration and its environmental policy. Oh no, we don't know what's going to happen. Maybe the president will become more presidential, and then somebody will say it's a failure of imagination. Well, Yandell Henderson was the guy who had the imagination, and he was absolutely right. And he was just so strident and wanted to do something about it, and they destroyed him. My view.
Good point, Alan.
Actually, let's go to Daniel.
I'm going to introduce him by doing this. Can you guys see it? Oh, it's reversed, isn't it? I'm sorry. Daniel Stone, author of American Poison, A Deadly Invention. Take it away, Dan. Dan, you're still here? Oh, I'm sorry. Do I have to do that unmute thing? Yes, I do. All right, sorry. There we go.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Alan, for those comments. And Bill, for throwing this whole thing together. My research over the past few years in my book has benefited from all of your research and many more people too. So I know a lot of you have been studying this for decades, and I benefit from it and have been able to tell this story to hopefully new people who can come to it as well. Tom, I'm really glad you mentioned Yandell, and I'm glad you mentioned who gets to tell this story, because that is kind of the centerpiece of what I have found. Obviously, many of us know the many kind of structural tenets of this story about innovation and an invention and sort of a PR push. And then, of course, back in the 70s and 80s, how it kind of wound down, and we're still dealing with that phase down now in many ways around the world. The question of who gets to tell this story is really embodied at this 1925 conference, which makes, I think, today such a remarkable moment, in that we ask this question: what happened? How did it happen? And why did it sort of end up the way it did? And I think it's exactly that. Who told the story and how did they tell it? And so the way the conference was structured initially by Hugh Cumming, the Surgeon General, was in this sort of way where he wanted every opinion to be heard equally. He wanted to arrange the chairs in a circle. That was his initial idea. He couldn't really fit everyone in the room, so he starts to, layer the chairs in rows. And then he starts to set the speaking order. And the speaking order, sort of just like a trial, it indicates who gets to be heard first and who gets to be heard kind of fresh in the morning. And so Ethel really gets those morning spots. And so we start with Charles Kettering. We start with Harrington. Is that right, Bill? I don't remember the exact order of the.
Yeah, I think. He was second,
yeah,
or third. Yes.
Yeah, basically the Ethel gets to make the first argument of how we developed this product and how it came together, and content aside, because they're allowed to make any claims that they want, and they do. Some are factually more flimsy than others, but they make this claim. And the opposition, people like Yandell Henderson or David Edsel from Harvard, are given the afternoon session. And so that's kind of the first very subtlety of this conference that really indicates where we might end up with it. And I think it's fitting. Alice Hamilton has been mentioned a few times today, and I'll just say she's the woman in my book, who I refer to as a deadly invention, and the woman who battled for environmental justice. She's the woman. And I think it's sort of fitting and maybe a little sobering that she is sort of reserved for the end of a discussion, similar to today, which is how she was back in that conference too, that she was a leading expert. She had studied lead at a profoundly detailed level. She had conducted statewide investigations and studies more than 15 years before tetraethyl lead was even investigated. And she was kind of excluded from this conference till the very, very, very end, when the air had kind of left the room. Everyone's tired, they want to go home. And so she's not as much a part of this story as a lot of the men who were able to tell this story and were given kind of prime replacement. To Tom's point about Yandell Henderson, he was also in that afternoon session. And he was like kind of an erratic guy. He spoke very forcefully, very strongly. He sat for a lot of interviews. He held back nothing in his advocacy. And so he was given, you know, what we give today to people who are bombastic. We give them a lot of attention, and sometimes they become president, you know, like that quality is valued in ways that being a woman, especially in that era, was not. Yeah. She was obviously right. She forecasted tetraethyl lead's destruction almost the moment it was invented. She cautioned against it. She warned and repeated herself. And in 1925 at the conference, during one of the breaks, was when she has this great confrontation with Midgley and Kettering, where she basically says, "You're willful murderers. You know this is going to be destructive. You know, and you have been warned, and you're going to do it anyway." And they laughed her out of the room. They laughed at her, and they could afford to because they had the backing of their industry and a very friendly government at the time too. I don't mean to carry so much water for Alice Hamilton, but I feel strongly about her legacy and the fact that she hasn't gotten nearly as much credit in this story or almost any other thing she was involved in her lifetime, even though she was right. So, Tom, I'd be very happy to talk with you another time about Yandell Henderson. I have a lot on him too. A remarkable guy. But I think what we can take from this session in the 1925 conference also is that science was sort of given a subpar placement at the conference. And I think that is what we can think of as maybe one of the original sins in this story that resulted in 50 years of this fuel being used, very lightly regulated, and eventually phased down, mostly because of the catalytic converter, and then regulation kind of followed. So I see this as a character story, and the way that these characters were seen, valued, and heard is very different for all of them, and especially for Alice Hamilton. So that's my piece, soapbox. I'd be happy to talk about it.
Can I just say I am so encouraged by the recovery of the people, the identities and the motivations and the complex personal advocacy from the time that is not just simply a critique of Thomas Midgley, which we've seen so much of, but a real attempt to understand, and certainly with Thomas and Dan Stone and others, the real attempt to understand the people of the time. And that's to the credit of historians and writers, I think, quite a lot. So it's very encouraging to see that. That's just my comment. And I would like to recognize Alan. I think you had your hand up. So let's go to Alan here. Whoops, wait. No, that's right. Okay. Did I do that wrong? Wait a minute. Where's Alan? All right, I did it wrong. All right, there we go.
Oh, I didn't yet have my hand up, but thanks for calling on me.
Oh, maybe that was from last time. That's all right.
So as someone who was the senior attorney in the lead face down and EPA at the same time, I mean, EPA basically had two programs going. One is to provide unleaded gasoline for cars with catalytic converters, and then to accelerate that process, which would have stretched out over a long period of time by removing or phasing down the lead that was in gasoline, and ultimately it focused on phasing down the lead and leaded. I really don't want to say that, I don't want to concede that the impetus was, behind this regulatory scheme was the catalytic converter. They were two. I mean, you should see the stuff that they went through trying to figure out how to coordinate the two things. It would be really oversimplified to say, oh, it's just the catalytic converter, so that drove the other thing. I don't think that's the case. And going back to the paper earlier about heart attacks, that really freaked people out in the early 1980s when we started getting data from NHANES 2 about heart attacks, and that we just all looked at each other and said, well, gee, the lead is something that has a negative impact on middle-aged white males. This is a Republican issue. So like we can go forward. Now we can do this. So there's a lot of complexity, and I don't want to minimize the public health aspect.
Thanks, Alan. I should say Alan and I talked a lot for my book. Thank you so much for your help. Also, I have a part in my book about the EPA in the 80s. I think you even told me that there was some surprise at the EPA, even among environmental experts, that there had been a 1925 conference and that the warnings were so clear 60 years prior, about the destructive effect this would have. So anyway, I'm not saying
without retelling the whole story, Jim Caldwell, who was like 3 levels down from Dick Wilson, who was director of the Office of Mobile Sources, came to me and said, well, so we want you to find this regulation by the Surgeon General on lead in gasoline. It's like, time out. I've been here 5 years. I've never heard that any other federal agency has a regulation on leaded gasoline. And he says to me, that's just the thing. No one at EPA has ever been able to find it. And my assignment was to go find it. And I did. And what came to me, they told me, oh, it's from the 1950s, right? Like 1957, well, whatever that is. It's like, and so I found it at the NIOSH library in Cincinnati, and they sent it to me. It's like, holy cow, it's from 1925. Who knew that modern environmental issues had any traction in 1925? This changes the story entirely. So I probably told you that story, but we were pretty much unaware.
Yeah, I think Dr. Nariyagu had a question.
Did he? No, I don't think. No, I don't see one there.
Oh, we can't
Ron,
mute.
Do you have a question?
He's muted. Bill, if you could.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Unmute. There we go.
Yeah. Okay. The issue talking about Henderson is at the meeting we had these two main groups. You have the medical doctors and occupational health people, and there were not really too many people on the environmental side. And then the people on the environmental side really didn't have much to very little data at the time to talk about, right? So that gave the Kehoe and his group an opportunity to simply push them aside because they had nothing to present or no evidence to present about what they're saying about future. They're talking about the future consequences, whereas leaded gasoline is a gift of God and had to be exploited or used right there. So that puts, unfortunately, because of the nature of the science, it put there, we couldn't really, people like Henderson were just guessing. That's the way they classify their contribution as educated guesses, rather than presenting any hard data to justify whatever they're saying. Whereas the medical docs actually have done some experiments and could actually present data to support whatever position they were taking. So,
it's interesting. There are a couple of other aspects to this, including when you say looking towards the future. I think we need to grapple with another issue that involves the continued use of very environmentally and health damaging constituents still in gasoline. And David Hallberg, who is an expert in this area, is here with us today. And I'm going to ask him to unmute. And I hope he's, Dave, are you there? And that's, yeah, there we go. Somehow, technology. Well, I think he's there. Of course, everybody saw the note in the, hang on a second. Yeah, so I don't know why Dave is not unmuting here and starting video. Maybe he's away. You might have seen the note in the chat where Joanne from Advanced Biofuels is adding links about the getting toxics out of transportation fuel. There is a free book you may know about. Burl Hagwood and Doug Durante, who are also here, wrote this, and it's really about BTEX compounds, which Alice Hamilton also warned about. It's kind of the other one of two other main routes to boost octane in gasoline. And I wonder if Doug Durante, are you available to speak to this, or Burl, either of you guys? And I want to just go ahead and I know Reed Detchen also knows something about this. Doug?
I'm here, Bill.
Hi. Can you tell us a little bit about
this? Oh, you can hear me now.
Issue? Yes. Can you? Oh, okay, good.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I wanted to apologize. Dave is a little under the weather. Asked me to pinch hit a little bit, but
oh, sure.
Yeah, but Dave and I and a lot of people on this call have been working on this issue of fuel quality for years, and I just find this whole subject fascinating, and what you guys have studied, and the real pros, the scientists and medical professionals on lead, and the similarities of what we're seeing are just really astounding to what we're going through now. And I just think it's worth going back real quickly to realize that when we heard earlier about Dave Dernberger of Minnesota, I mean, he was not only led, but then transferred that knowledge and that passion into the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. And the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments is when we really tackled in the mobile source provisions the fuel quality. So, the good news is, we got the lead out. The bad news is a chart that we saw earlier, and I believe is in our book, is as that lead is precipitously going down, you make an X because the aromatic content is going up. And we heard the word toxics associated with lead, but all of these aromatic compounds are benzene, as you well know, Bill, but some of you others might not quite be aware. These are all benzene and benzene-derived derivatives. We call them BTEX. It's benzene, toluene, xylene. These are really bad actors. And so as lead went down, Boyd and Gray, who the late Boyd and Gray, are one of our great legal minds on these issues and an expert in the Clean Air Act, often use the term that we traded a poison for a carcinogen. And that's really true, because all of those, benzene is in itself a known carcinogen. These other products are considered to be suspected carcinogens. So again, we got Dernberger and Tom Daschle and some of our people in the Senate. Not to be a political, and I am a policy guy, not a technical guy, but a policy guy. So we try to translate all this into policy. If you go back and someone were to read the Federal Register back in March of 1990, I mentioned Daschle, Dernberger, some of these people, Tom Harkin from Iowa, who headed the Health Committee. They knew what they were talking about. They talked about reactivity of not only benzene itself, but the other emissions would form more benzene. So I just kind of grimaced when I heard, the history of what you guys have studied, that they said there wasn't enough information in 1925 to ban lead. We had plenty of information in 1990. not only did we have plenty of information, but that was translated into specific legislative requirements and an endangerment finding by Congress that these products were bad. They're regulated as air toxics, and they are supposed to be reduced. And over time, again, the similarities of using counter scientists, counter science to say, they're not so bad. Everything about these is bad. They travel long distances. They persist in the environment. It's just, again, that's why we're tied in with you on this. And so EPA ducked and bobbed and weaved and avoided dealing with this. It is a requirement in the Clean Air Act for them to use everything at their disposal, including emerging technologies, to reduce these air toxics. So they've not done that. We've been after them every time that they open up the CAFE bill, the fuel economy bill, which is a great opportunity to do it. Say, okay, well, let's increase octane. The auto industry wants octane increased because it lets them get better mileage and makes their life easier to meet mileage requirements. Well, that was a perfect time to say, sure, let's increase octane, but let's not make the same mistake we made before and allow this to be made with a bad product. So we have essentially failed at that, even with strong Democratic administrations, and we were particularly frustrated because the modeling, we finally got them to admit, and that's part of what's in our book, that through a lot of emails that Boyd and Gray was very involved in, a lot of freedom of information emails where they conspired with the oil industry to do some of the testing. So they blamed it on ethanol, and they were able to really turn some of that modeling and testing upside down and say, gee, we just don't see it. Well, it's quite there. I mean, the emissions of these fine particulates that are directly related. General Motors, of all people, says that 96% of the fine particulates that come from cars and is in the air is due to aromatics. So we have all this information. So we're trying to kind of learn. We want to take what you guys have done, so many of you, the great work you've done, and see if we can move that into more policy, because the laws are on the books. And it's been very frustrating. The last administration was so committed to electric vehicles. I was told by lower staff people at EPA that they were not able to really help anything in gasoline because it looked like they were helping gasoline at the expense of electric vehicles. Well, electric vehicles are going backwards right now. They're not going to be there. We are going to see a recent DOE study came out that 50% or more of new cars either require or are recommended for premium. Well, all those aromatics are in there for octane, and that's one of ethanol's strongest points is its octane enhancing abilities. In fact, even going back to the 1990 Clean Air Act legislation and the discussion that you would see in that Federal Register, they talk about. And there was the oil guys were saying, well, yeah, we don't have anything else to use. We go, yeah, we do. So ethanol was specifically pointed out as a alternative for that. So with all of that background, we have just, where does it take us to today? Well, we have what could be a stroke of fortune. Boyd and Gray has passed away, but one of his chief guys, a fellow by the name of Adam Gustafson, is now Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Justice for the Environmental Division. And their job is to enforce environmental laws. So we have written a letter recently. Bill is on it, and myself, and Reed Detchen, and Reg Modlin, another one of my advisors, a former Chrysler executive, Scott Sklar, a couple of other people to go to Adam and say, look, you've said in your previous life as a private attorney representing fuel interests that this needs to be done. And again, keep looking at the lead example. We waited too long on that, as you guys, again, have articulated very well and studied very well. We waited too long to kind of figure that out. But let's not make a similar mistake by replacing one bad thing with another. So we're hoping that Adam will take a look at that. But what we would like to do is build on everything you've done on lead, but get smart, good people like you to join us in calling for this change, because it's been on the books since 1990 and it just hasn't happened. But we need people like you, everybody on this call, to stand up and do more things like this and force them into enforcing the law. But it is clearly a public health issue. And again, at the risk of repeating myself, the similarities between the lead story and this are just so clear. Everything from the way that EPA handled it, everything from the way that we had bad science. And it's an interesting story. It's captured very much in our book. We have email trails in that book, but it's bigger than that. It's a movement that would really change the whole construction of fuel as we go forward. So that's where we are, and we really like to build on what you've done.
I just hit the unmute all button, so that anybody who wants to jump in certainly can. And it's a good point to jump in because it's not just lead. And it was recognized at the time that benzene was in 1922, I think was a paper by Alice Hamilton about the risk of benzene in gasoline and the risk of, it was pretty well known back to Percival Potts and the origins of public health research really involved carcinogens and coal tar, especially benzene. So Percival Potts from the 1770s, I'm sorry. So this idea that we don't study things in isolation either by discipline or by historical category, I think is what animates, for me at least, the putting together small conferences like this, and I certainly appreciate everybody here pitching in on that. I wonder if others, you say Dave Hallberg is not really feeling so great. I wonder if Joanne or Reed have any input they'd like to contribute at this point. And I did do the sort of, there we go.
Well, Reed has studied this aromatics issue
oh yeah,
maybe more than anybody and written some terrific pieces. I hope he's still on. And
if you don't know Reed Detchen, he's with the United Nations Foundation and has put on a bunch of conferences about pollution issues, and especially in this area.
Well, I apologize for my screen here. I managed to get my morning workout done during the first hour or so. But the only thing I wanted to add that Doug hasn't mentioned is since this is thinking about 1925, the role of ethanol back in the day. Initially drove an E30 vehicle to his conference in 1925. So they knew perfectly well that ethanol was an adequate octane enhancer, but obviously the profit motive was not aligned with ethanol. It was aligned with their own proprietary lead product. So Tom Beller and Dr. Kovar is going to come in with the information here, but the historic use of, but it was Midgley was an advocate initially of ethanol as an octane enhancer until his mind got changed by the profit motive.
There were quite a few advocates. Alexander Graham Bell, very strong article in 1918 in National Geographic, and some of the original researchers who worked on octane, the great octane race is what I call it. For example, Harry Ricardo with a highest useful compression ratio approach as opposed to the octane reference fuel approach. We do need to take into account the alternative pathways that were pretty much available in the 20s. Think about those. And then today, when you talk to people about ethanol, for example, one of the first things that starts to happen is people recoil in horror. Oh my God, you're going to talk about ethanol, or you're going to talk about, biofuels. Aren't they terrible for the environment? And in comparison, I mean, the answer is no, but reasonable people have serious doubts that have been sown by an industry that's trying to protect itself, which is not unknown and not really unusual. But it is time to start thinking seriously about biofuels and where they come from, how they're produced, with environmental concerns, but also with clean fuels as the end concern, as part of this conversation about the history of leaded gasoline and also aromatics, BTEX compounds as well. So that's the 2 cents as I see it. I am working on a book called The Great Octane Race, and there's some surprises in it But the history of this has been very heavily obscured. So it's kind of rough going. Anybody knows anything about U.S. industrial alcohol of Baltimore, Maryland, I'd be interested because they were the big wheels in research at the time, and they created the anhydrous process, and they did blending research with Columbia University professors that were that are today completely unknown. There's a lot to the story that has still not come out, even though we've got these two great books. There's more to do. There's more work to do, and I really appreciate these conversations that give us all an idea of where this could go and where maybe it needs to go. So let me ask everybody here, what's your project? What do you think needs to be done historically to help move the conversation about public health forward? And Joanne, you're still muted, so let me go ahead and ask you. I may have to individually ask
Okay.
people to unmute.
I think, all right, I think I'm on.
There we go.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I would like to say, yeah, what you were saying, the need for the education, the need for people to know more about this. That's why Advanced Biofuels USA exists. We're a nonprofit educational organization. We have an online free library with nearly 55,000 indexed items. And you are all welcome to use it, to tell everybody about it. We are feedstock process and product agnostic. We just want people to understand what the stuff is, have a place to find information about it.
And of course, you know, we are all going to have a lot of cross links available, so that 55,000, you say, boy, there are a lot of things that are available online through, you know, well, anyway, we'll talk more about
Yeah,
that.
it's but you know, when you talk renewable fuels, you're not just talking ethanol, you're talking hydrogen, you're talking
Biodiesel. Sure.
biodiesel, you're talking renewable diesel, you're talking about sustainable aviation fuel or synthetic aviation fuel, as that guy who thinks there's an American Gulf wants to call it. And so I'm really people who are, I would love to get this information out to teachers, that environmental science students probably don't even have an hour in their entire education about renewable fuels.
Sure. Or about the pioneers in environmental history who have tried to make our technology safer, our workplaces safer, our public health more proactive. And those people really need to be remembered in history. It's not all just the Alamo and the deserved recognition for the heroes of World War II. There are heroes on the home front as well.
Well, I was thinking, like when I think of what we do, what I do with indexing these items is sort of what AI does, but what I've tried to search for things, you know, just do Google searches, and I searching some terms, I don't even get the renewable fuels or the biofuels part of it. Some of the terms just go other places. So that's why that's why I think what we do is still really important, because you can't find it other places. And when people are doing searches, a lot of times our stuff comes up. And you know, so take a look. Some of we'll get into bioeconomy, because you can't just get rid of the barrel of oil by getting rid of the fuel part of it. So we get into chemicals and biomanufacturing and all kinds of other stuff.
Well, thank you. There was somebody else who was trying to come in here, and we don't have to end right at 1 here, by the way. This is a great thing about this sort of conversation. But someone else was trying to come in. Who was that? There was a little bit of
Reed.
Oh, was that Reed? Do I need to keep doing this darn ask to unmute thing? Oh my gosh. Maybe I do.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer Tom Beller's question earlier because I had to look up the reference. It was from Jamie Kidman's The Secret History of Lead. That was a wonderful article in the Nation some years ago. But what I took from it was in 1921, Midgley drove to a meeting of the SAE using a gasoline blend with 30% ethanol. The benefits, he said, this is Midgley himself said, quote, clean burning and freedom from any carbon deposit, tremendously high compression under which alcohol will operate without knocking. Because of the possible high compression, the available horsepower is much greater with alcohol than with gasoline. So this is before he got into lead. This is 1921, but he was driving an E30 vehicle in 1921.
By the way, I've been in touch with Jamie Kipman just while we were having this conversation, and he's sorry that he could not be here. He says that there is a docudrama called Midge underway, which is focusing on Thomas Midgley and some of his issues and problems, and with leaded gasoline especially, but also Midgley is known to have helped create chlorofluorocarbons, and that's destructive to the ozone. Although at the time was seen as an advancement. So was leaded gasoline in a way seen as an advancement at the time. So there is this this issue is probably going to heat up, I think is the bottom line. And for all of us, we'll all be called upon to be supportive of other historians, I think, and scientists who are advocates for public health, as well as policy directions that make a lot of sense. Boy, do I miss Dave Durenberger. He was a terrific guy. I'm so glad to hear his name come up. But there's a couple others I could mention that also that we also miss, and certainly. Bill Holmberg is one, and someone else who was the who was the attorney who spoke at the conference read that you mentioned a little while ago. Public practice.
What?
Those
not Boyd and Gray.
Yeah, Boyd and Gray is who I'm trying to think of.
Yeah,
yeah, those guys, had a lot of momentum going here, and I think that would be great if it came back. So that there are plenty of opportunities where it could. Without going into ethanol, which would be a whole different other discussion, and reasonable people have disagreed on this, but I think reasonable people don't always have the same foundation of facts that they need. So part of the job is to get those facts out. I hope we can do more to.
Just add one more thing on the parallels that Doug laid out very nicely. My particular interest is an element of aromatics called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAH. These are essentially the bad actors in aromatics, in my opinion. And Dr. Pereira at Columbia University has done epidemiological research linking PAH concentrations in the parts per trillion in the atmosphere to the same kinds of prenatal and infant health effects you see with lead. So lower IQ, ADHD, various aspects that are really repeating the lead story. Now, the parallel isn't necessarily perfect, but it's so similar that it really calls for action. And when we have a ready substitute available to phase down or eliminate aromatics in gasoline, it's beyond shocking that EPA has not been able to see their way to this.
It is.
Doug, you might add
What's
more
her
to
name
that, but
again? What's the researcher's name again?
for PERERA for
Right. Okay.
Yeah, Bill, I have to run. I have another meeting very soon.
I
So
am
it's been
going to wrap things up.
a pleasure.
And it's a pleasure to have you, Dr. Naraju, as always. Reed and Doug and Howard and Alan and Dave and Thomas and Joanne, thank you all so much for coming. I will be posting this later today or tomorrow on posting the video today or tomorrow, and it's so useful. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for doing this, Bill. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks so much.
Bye now.
Good.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.